Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of 1968. In the previous lecture, as we turned our eyes to the international community and protest around the world, I talked about the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. In this lecture, we turn to events in one of Czechoslovakia's neighbors, Poland. In March, the fever of protest spread to Poland. The immediate cause of unrest was the banning of a new production of a favorite and traditional Polish play, Dziady, which means forefathers. Under Nikita Khrushchev in 1956 to 57, for a brief time there had been a cultural thaw in Poland. Censorship was lowered. Outside literature, film, and theater were allowed in. A new leader came to power. But quickly the thaw faded, and old restrictions resumed. The trouble started in January 1968, when the Polish authorities shut down production of the play. The play had met with a thunderous and popular reception from audiences. There were a few anti-Soviet lines in the play, but authorities were more suspicious of its emphasis on religion and mysticism. Crowds loved it. After the premiere, 300 students marched through the streets in celebration. 2 students were arrested. In Poland, because virtually all political dissent was banned, culture became the only outlet for social expression. The classics were hugely popular. Theaters and concert halls were packed. The theater was one of only a few places where the people could feel a sense of solidarity, as they cheered along with appropriate lines from Shakespeare, Sophocles, or others. In Poland, a unique, complicating factor was the role of the Church. The Catholic Church had conspired with each government to encourage repression. The only movement that the Church had no influence was Reform Communism, a movement on the rise along with socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia. On the third day of protest, some 10,000 people gathered to support the students. They chanted slogans and burned copies of the party newspaper. Steel-helmeted riot police launched a baton charge to clear the crowd. Protesters responded with chants of "Gestapo, Gestapo." Eventually, protesters fleeing the police charged the Ministry of Culture building, stormed the building, and fought back against police by flinging furniture and books. The protest, originating in Warsaw, quickly spread to the rest of the country. There were violent police attacks against protesters all over the country. Many people were savagely beaten, and thousands were jailed. Government officials restored order, in part by whipping up popular resentment of the protesters by playing on old prejudices. They accused Jews of inciting the protest. It's important to keep in mind that those who were living in Poland in 1968, many of them had lived through the repression and the Holocaust of the World War II era. Those who were 40 or 50 in 1968 had been 20 or 30 in the midst of the Holocaust 20 or so years prior. And so to be repressed again in their own homeland was a doubly insulting practice. The Polish Communist Party played the race card. The party newspaper published lists of Jewish students, claiming that they were the instigators, although many of them were merely harmless bystanders, and in many cases had nothing whatsoever to do with the demonstrations. Officials organized counter-demonstrations, chanting anti-Jewish slogans. Factory workers were forced to attend rallies against these so-called enemies of Poland. First Secretary Władysław Gomulka was stuck in the middle, accused by some of being too soft on the protesters and others of being too harsh. He made speeches urging the protesters to quiet down and asking students to call off their protests. Students responded by seizing control of their school on March 19th. The school was draped with banners like "Warsaw with the students," "Workers, your cause is ours," and "Don't lie to our fathers, workers, and peasants." Students handed out leaflets to the crowds. By March 22nd, over 10,000 people had gathered outside the university in support of the students. Riot police arrived on the scene and began to disperse the crowd. Then a report over the radio. Students would be expelled from the school unless they ceased their protest. A huge crowd gathers again. One of the students announced that about 4,000 students had decided to defy the ultimatum. The crowd cheered. Students occupied the administration building for a few more hours. But by the next day, the protests had died down. Government repression and anti-Semitic propaganda had succeeded in diffusing the protest. By the end of March, the movement was over. The anti-Semitic campaign, however, continued. Jews in the country were put out of work, driven from their homes, and in many cases forced out of the country. Before 1968, there were some 40,000 Jews living in Poland. By the end of the year, only about 5,000 remained. For those who had survived the Holocaust a few decades earlier, this was a second crushing blow to their life experience.